So I'm going to talk today about Trinity's colonial legacies. So I think our sense of how we do or do not feel connected to Trinity is based on all sorts of things: class, its history, its location, the way Trinity has dealt with its surrounding area, how it's related to communities, and so on. So I'm going to return to that in the end. I'm going to give a kind of an image-heavy talk, partly so you have something else to look at apart from me. And I'm going to concentrate on two things that we have put at the centre of a project we call Trinity's Colonial Legacies. It's been running for 2 years. It will finish at the end of this year. And it's been a sort of a wide-ranging exploration of what connection we have to things like transatlantic slavery, what connection we have to things like racial science, and what we need to think about in relation to those. But it affects not just Trinity, but the whole country, and certainly the communities that surround us as well. So what are colonial legacies and why do they matter? Why should you care about them? We feel, I think, slightly differently about them after the events of 2020, after the global kind of reconsideration of monuments, statues, buildings named after slave owners. Some of that has come from North American context. You can see here in the Capitol invasion back in January 2021, people marching Confederate flags through the US Capitol building and so on. You've seen some pretty dramatic manifestations of that. And there's also been manifestations of it in Ireland. Here's the Columbus statue being knocked down in Minnesota. Here's a statue of a Belgian soldier who had a long history in the Congo, being vandalized by protesters in Brussels in Belgium. So we're seeing lots of this sort of thing, a lot of anger being expressed against monuments that are in our public space that make us feel strongly one way or another that they need to come down. The most famous one close to home, I suppose, was kind of the vandalization. I mean, I'm reluctant to use that word, certainly a protest at Churchill's statue in London. We've seen statues come down in places like Barbados. This is a statue of Nelson, who of course was knocked down in Dublin a long time ago. Took Barbados a bit longer, but they did it in style. A 3-hour state ceremony where they sort of danced around and completely reinterpreted the statue and then took it down. So less dramatic than Dubliners who just blew it up, but anyway. And then Colston, famously in Bristol, a slave trading port town right beside us, throwing one of the most prominent statues of a slave owner into the drink. And depending on your political persuasion, you'll see this as an unruly mob throwing statues and desecrating kind of public space, or you might see it as a perfectly explainable frustration, building up to a point where eventually it crosses over and leads to a situation like this. So where does Trinity come into it? Where does this part of Dublin come into it? The most prominent statue or building related to a slave owner in Dublin is in fact in Trinity's campus, the Berkeley Library, now no longer called the Berkeley Library. But there are other colonial markers in Dublin, and often ones we don't think of. So here we are, Nelson's Pillar. The head of Nelson can be still seen, of course, just across the road in Pearse Street Library, if you ever want to go up there to the reading room. An interesting history all of its own. But of course, famously gotten rid of, around the time of the 50th commemoration of 1916, an old imperial marker right there in the centre of the city, and one that was finally kind of dispensed with. And late in the game, we'd already blown up most of the statues related to British occupation in Ireland prior to that. So most of the ones in College Green went. Here's King William III, blown up. It's a statue that was there from 1701, but it was blown up in 37. Here's the one in the centre of Stephen's Green. I often feel most Dubliners, I can't speak for this room, but a lot of contemporary Dubliners don't know that the sort of bandstand in that area was once the location of this statue of George II. All of these statues blown up mostly just after independence in the 1920s and 1930s. Mackin Street itself, the street we're on right now, of course, is a really good example of a street that's named after a revolutionary rename from a British street name. So Ireland went through a very profound kind of period of changing names, changing street names, and blowing up statues and reorienting public space. It's partly why we don't connect ourselves to the British Empire all that much anymore. We don't see it in our landscape. Which brings us to Trinity's library. So this is our famous, either really beautiful or really ugly concrete building in the middle of it. Yeah, how many people think it's really ugly? I completely disagree with you, by the way. Anyway, I think it's beautiful. But anyway, it was called the New Library when it was opened up in 1967, not called the Berkeley Library. And it was renamed after George Berkeley. I like to say Ireland's most famous philosopher, but actually Ireland's only famous philosopher, truth be told, in 1978. So really modern building, no direct connection to George Berkeley at all, and named at a time when it was reasonably well known amongst academics that George Berkeley had owned and enslaved people in Rhode Island in America. So timing is important, I'll come back to that in a minute. But we're not very far away from an imperial and slave owner monument when we're sitting right here. So this is Mackay Bridge. It's literally a stone's thrown away from where we're all sitting, right beside the Google building. It's a modern, really ugly bridge that's built on the site of an older bridge named after George Mackay, a banker, but also somebody who invested heavily in the sugar trade, and also somebody whose son was a really prominent slave owner. So it's a direct local place name that comes from an Irish enslaver, just like Berkeley. Here it is. You can see how ugly it is. The reason I show you this image from a student of mine is you can see the old bridge structure just underneath the new one, down by the Google building. Sure, we might have to rename the Google building shortly, you never know. Okay, leads us to a question. Why am I talking about Irish people in relation to slavery? I think Irish people generally don't connect our history to one of colonization out there in the world. We think of ourselves mostly as a group of people, and rightly so, that were colonized by the British over many hundreds of years. That's true, but it's important for us to also admit that lots of Irish people were also involved in the colonization of the rest of the world, whether that's in the settler colonial empire in places like Australia or North America, or in colonies of what we call sort of sugar colonies of exploitation, places in the Caribbean in the 18th and early 19th century. So when you ask this sort of flat question, did Dubliners own, trade or profit from enslaved people, the answer you come back with invariably is that yes, some of them did. And it's interesting to think about that, and interesting to think about our history and the way that we normally talk about our history in relation to that simple, salient fact. Skip that for a minute. So around the time George Floyd and Colston protests were happening, I was, like the rest of you, stuck in my house with a 2-kilometre limit set around me during COVID. And an interesting little project developed as a result of that. I live in Drumcondra, and because I was bored out of my tree and had a small baby to walk around the area in a buggy half the day at the time, I began to kind of wonder, I wonder if the big houses in my direct locality had any connection to slavery. Because I'd seen one of my colleagues down in UCD, Fionnuala O'Kane, do a really good piece of work on villas in Blackrock and Donnybrook and around that little belt of kind of super rich South Dublin. And what she found was that all 3 big house domains that UCD are built on, for example, got to bash UCD first before Trinity, all had connections to Jamaican sugar plantations, including Belfield. Belfield is the name that we still call UCD by. Belfield is named for a plantation in Jamaica called Belfield by the Diggs-Latouche family. So I kind of wondered, okay, well, maybe North Dublin, which has lots of big houses, maybe it also had lots of buildings that were connected to the slave trade. And sure enough, it did. There were buildings in Glasnevin, Donnycarney House, Thorndale, which is the one I began with up here, big huge farm owned by a Wilson family called Wilson. See Dolores here, sorry, no relation Dolores, sorry. I'm sure, I already checked that out, you're grand. I know where I'm talking. So sure enough, I found lots of big houses that were connected to the slave trade. Here's one on the other side. It's actually the same family. This is in Dartry, back to bashing South Dublin. This is the 3rd most expensive street in Ireland, apparently. And this house was sold for $4 million back in 2019. Now this house directly comes out of Trinidad slave profits from the Wilson family. It's easy enough to trace that in the early 19th century. So there's all sorts of houses, all sorts of different types of houses as well. Some of them repurposed as convents and institutions. Some of them have just kind of remained in family hands right down to the present. This lovely little Unitarian church, you'll all know it, Stephen's Green. Exactly half of the money for that comes from the same Trinidad plantation. This is just one family, by the way, the Wilsons. So when we start looking for it, you will find the traces of transatlantic slavery in Dublin. You just have to take your time and look for it. And there's this lovely stained glass window done in memory of Thomas Wilson, the donor to the church in the middle of it. So that's directly honouring, a bit like the Berkeley Library, an Irish slave owner. Here's some South Dublin domains, again, just to show you. So there's Belfield. This is named after a Jamaican. There's Oakley Lodge, same thing. That's owned by a Catholic family called O'Connor Blake. Parsons Green and Oaklands in Stillorgan, they're all prominent villa houses with connections to slave owners. So whether we like it or not, and whether we like to tell ourselves we're just unidirectional victims of colonization, actually it's not that simple, right? It's much more complicated. And you might say to me, well, that's okay, that's just Anglo-Irish, or oh, that's just Protestant families. It's not true. There's Quakers, Unitarians, Protestants, and Catholics. There's no distinction between religions as to who's a slave owner and who's not. So there's no get out of jail card. Coolock, so this was bought by the Mercy order, and my own mother was educated in that house. And then a couple of ones in town. Again, this is all in my 2K limit, more or less. So Belvedere Place, quite close to Drumcondra. There's a house there, Cavendish Row as well, and a good few of the houses by the quays all have connections to the slave trade. So the reason I'm showing you all this is not because it directly bears on Trinity, although I'll get to Trinity in a minute. It's to show you that Ireland itself has a kind of a fairly deep engagement with slavery that we don't really know about and we don't really talk about. So, what about Trinity? What about Trinity indeed? In some ways, I think, like people often say to me, well, you don't need a project on Trinity's colonial legacies. Everybody knows Trinity is like an epicenter of colonialism, right? But actually, it's probably worth teasing out exactly how and why. So we had a 2-year project. We got funded by the Provost Office. It was, I think it's fair to say, in reaction to student protests against the Berkeley Library that we were funded. So basically, a project was dreamt up at short notice once student protests became prevalent in front of the Berkeley Library. And we scheduled it as a 2-year project, and we hired a postdoc, and we did all the usual academic things where you spend a lot of time sitting around meeting rooms talking about nothing, and eventually we decided to do something, and that was a 2-year project. So we hired a really brilliant postdoc called Mobeen Hussain, and we put together, I suppose, a couple of priorities. What were the most obvious colonial legacies that we had on campus, and what could we do about them? We didn't just want to sit around talking about it, we wanted to do things as well. We had an advisory board with the Chancellor of the University, Mary McAleese, who was great, who chaired it. And then we also had lots of external people like Vince Brown at Harvard, who's coming to give a lecture in a couple of weeks' time. You're more than welcome to come to it. And people like Fionnuala Kane and so on. We also had lots of brilliant interns and a PhD student, Gabriel, who's still working with us, and they all did brilliant work over the last couple of years. What were our guiding principles? Again, we wanted everything we did to be transparent, right? So anything that we discovered, we wanted to put it up straight away on our website, and we also wanted to create a document that anybody could download. We didn't want to be hidden or contained about anything that we did, because there's no point. As I often say in Trinity, people think the worst of Trinity anyway, so you have no reputation to worry about, right? You really don't. Don't worry about your risk management. Just get on with it and show what we have. And we also wanted it to be about race and racism. Right? We live in a world that's defined by race, racial anxieties, racism, and there's no point trying to hide that this kind of work connects to that. And then we wanted it to be research-based. We are researchers, and that's what it always comes back to. And we were inspired by other movements. Black Lives Matter, definitely, although we don't say that the work we do is decolonial, and we don't say that it's directly connected to Black Lives Matter, it's not. But it's inspired by the energy of those things. And it's also inspired by places like the University of Cape Town, who were the first to take down a statue of Cecil Rhodes, and really began the movement of universities being critical about their own history in the modern era. Right, so what do we talk about when we talk about Trinity's colonial legacies? The first important thing to say about Trinity is it colonised Ireland. It's part of the colonisation of Ireland. Most of its money comes from the colonisation of Ireland, not of other places. And that makes it different from Oxford or Cambridge or Edinburgh or Harvard or Yale to some degree. So it's a little known fact that for about 250 years of our existence, we owned land in 18 of the 36 counties of Ireland. We owned 1.5% of the land mass of the country, one of the biggest landlords in the entire colonial period. And you can see that most of it is in North Kerry, some of it's in South Kerry, quite a bit of it's in Armagh and Donegal. Now, was Trinity a great landlord? No, that's for sure. Do we know much about the management of Trinity Estates? Not really, partly because it was all done by middlemen for plausible deniability. But basically what's important about this image is that it's worth noticing that most of the money that Trinity is built on, all that money that gives it its privilege and status that we see right down to the present, that comes from the colonisation of Ireland, the dispossession of Irish people on Irish land, and that's the core of where our privilege comes from. But that's not all. So that's easily enough established, and we've done a bit of work on it and we'll do more. And we want to talk about it more as well, because it's important, I think, for Irish people to get a bit more clarity on exactly how Trinity's money came to be. And it's also important to know how rich it was. In the mid-19th century, Trinity had £90,000 a year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but in the mid-19th century, it's an enormous amount of money, not far off what Oxford and Cambridge have had. So Trinity was rich, really rich. It taught very few students, and basically the fellows and provost had, plenty of money to spend on good wine. And if you look at what they produced in the 19th century, I think they mostly just drank that, to be honest with you. So we decided we'd focus on two aspects we can't do it all, right? So we try and do two pieces of public work on the Colonial Legacies project. And the first was to look at all the human remains that we had on site. I'll show you a map of in a moment. Because people are very invested in the repatriation of human remains. It's a very live issue across the whole world, and we have lots of them on site. They're not a couple hundred meters away from here, most of them. And we also concentrated on the Berkeley Library because we had to do that, because the students were invested in it, and it was the most global issue for us to sort out. So we ended up with two global, I suppose, media stories that emerged out of that over the spring and the summer. The second of which is the reburial of 13 crania in Inishbofin, a tiny island off the coast of Galway and Mayo, with a population of 186 people. And we returned human remains there in July. It was a really interesting process to be involved in, partly because it raised the spectre of an Irish university returning remains to an Irish community, even though we had collected those skulls for basically a racist research project. Stolen them, I should say. And the other big issue was the Berkeley Library, and I'm going to talk about those briefly. Happy to take questions on them, obviously, afterwards. So first, the human remains. Where do we have human remains? How many do we have? Where are they all from? This is just a sample map of the human remains that were collected in Trinity, mostly between the early 19th century and the early 20th century. It's an amazing map, because when you see it spread out like that, you realise, oh yeah, Trinity graduates were involved in the colonisation of everywhere, right? Not just Ireland, certainly not in the 19th century. Some of them are really complex. I'm not going to go into massive detail on them, but we know, for example, exactly where the Nigerian ones were taken, by whom, and we know we shouldn't have them. Like, our own archives tell us that they were stolen. Same thing goes for the Indian and the Burmese, now Myanmar. How many do we have? We have 484 skulls, so crania. I'm not going to show you an image of it. Not without warning anyway. And we have 28 full skeletons, and that's what we know we have. And then we have an unknown number of bones that were taken from Dublin graveyards in a systematic way, actually, by the anatomy department in the early 19th century. So a mixture again shows you that Trinity is happy to colonise Irish people, it's also happy to colonise elsewhere. How do we get them back to Inishbofin? So we took the Inishbofin Island crania as a sort of test case, and the reason we could do that was because the community already knew that we had them, and there was already activists working on it. So we knew we had people that we could work with, and we knew that there was what you call a community of origin for them to go back to. So what did we ask them to do? First of all, we ignored them for several years, which I think is shameful. And then eventually in 2021 into 2022, we started to work with them in an engaged way, partly because of the Legacies project. So what we asked them to do was go and get a petition. Petitions are how you get anything done. And 165 people out on the island, out of a resident population of 183, signed that petition. So 90% of the population, so a little bit more than that, which gave us a really good context for sending them back. And just before Christmas in 2022, we got the provost and the board to agree to return the remains after an open round of submission. So anybody in the country with a vested interest in it could submit their evidence-based submission to us, and it was all published online, so you can go back and read every argument that was made in favour of keeping them or in favour of bringing them back. That's all up there forever. That was part of the process. And then we eventually decided to give them back. So we asked a member of the community, the Day family, to create a traditional Inishbofin coffin made of pine. Here he is making it. That's their idea. Again, everything about the burial, everything, all the details, that was all decided by that community, not by Trinity, once we made the decision. There we are. Again, I kind of thought it would be interesting if we all went down and dug the grave, but anyway, I didn't want that. I'm joking, it's no joke to dig a grave. So this was the site, this was the return of the crania. I'm not showing you the actual crania. She'll thank me for it because it's kind of macabre. But they were buried together again at the request of the community themselves. So this was a really interesting thing to be involved with. We were spectators once we made the decision. We just provided the evidence documents from our end. But it was kind of an amazing moment, and it was covered reasonably broadly. You might have seen it over the summer. There's the provost meeting, so we had a ceremony in Trinity and then a burial ceremony on the island itself. And we did seem like basically everybody in Inishbofin was there that day. And we returned it basically on the same day they were stolen 130 years later. So the second issue, that left us with the second issue to kind of think about, which is the Berkeley issue, and what to do with that. And it's funny, I was just talking to, I think it was Peter earlier, yeah. We were talking about the arguments that have been had about this Berkeley denaming and renaming issue. And there's lots of debate about it, still is debate about it in Trinity and so on, and outside of Trinity. So there's lots of media coverage on this from the time the students began to protest, and there's lots of people who've been saying, well, you know, this is sort of an American issue. Why do we have to get dragged into this slavery debate? Sure, that's nothing to do with Ireland. And as I hope I've kind of already showed you in the first few slides, it actually is something to do with Ireland. And what we're dealing with in the Irish context and the Dublin context, it's just a lack of awareness that we're part of this story, I think. And then there's a kind of a wider set of arguments against denaming anything. You shouldn't do that because you're erasing history, right? You hear that a lot, and I'm very happy to talk about that afterwards. I'm a historian, and as I like to say, history is just a bunch of arguments about the past that never ends. And if it did end, and if everybody agreed on any set of facts related to it, I'd be out of a job straight away. So I'm interested in that argument continuing. So what legacies do we have related to Berkeley? We have a stained glass window, kind of a epoxy one in the chapel, not particularly nice, in my opinion, done up in the 19th century. We had one direct legacy that was given to us by Berkeley himself. Berkeley was a former librarian in Trinity, as well as being a philosopher in the early part of his career, and he found these gold medals, which, luckily for us, the money for which has just run out 5 years ago, so they're kind of gone off the table. But that was the only direct benefaction from him. What did we find out when we went and did the evidence work on Berkeley? In a way, there was much less research to do than there was for Inishbofin, because Berkeley's papers are on microfilm. You can go in and read them in the National Library. Anybody can. And if you look through them, you'll find a file which, basically from various deeds of sale and his own will, you can see very clear references to him buying and selling humans. It's really not up for debate. Modern biographers of Berkeley just tell you, yeah, he definitely owned slaves. We know he owned 4, maybe 5, and it was probably a lot more, but this is what we have evidence for. So there was never a question about whether Berkeley owned slaves. It's about whether that matters or not, or whether you should take a name off a building because of it. But there was a further thing. Not only was Berkeley involved in selling and buying slaves for his plantation in Rhode Island, he also argued for the retention of slavery even after you baptized your slaves. So in the early 18th century, one of the big arguments against baptizing your enslaved property was that if you turned them into Christians, you'd have to let them free. Right? How could you have the dignity of a Christian compromised by the indignity of chattel slavery? So in his sermons and in his philosophy and in his public works, he argued for the retention of slavery. And to me, that's just as bad as his enslavement of others, because it probably held back the whole idea of abolition for a generation or two, because he was that influential in his time. Here's again, you can read these on, if you're interested in it, you can download these pamphlets. I'm not suggesting you don't have better things to do than that. But you can see even from here, a proposal for the better supplying of churches in our flower plantations and converting the savage Americans to Christianity. One of his big ideas was he wanted to put a university staffed by Trinity staff on the island of Bermuda, which he thought was 60 miles off the coast of North America. It was actually 600 miles off, which suggests he hasn't thought every aspect of it through. But his plan was that college was going to be used to kidnap, if necessary, Native Americans and convert them to Christianity, and then create sort of a student body out of that. So there's lots of aspects to George Berkeley. He was a brilliant philosopher in loads of ways, but generations of his biographers, some of whom worked for Trinity, sort of systematically kept that aspect of his thought quiet. And what we would say as a modern university is that we didn't have the right to do that anymore, and that we had to think about who we decide to honour in our public space very carefully. And here's the telling little piece of evidence again as I kind of wind up on this Berkeley issue. This is a memo sent by a fellow called George Dawson, and by all accounts was lovely. He was registrar of the university but in 1977. And he simply sent a little letter to the provost. This is a memo. And it was around the time the Arts Block building was being built in Trinity. And what happens is when there's empty space, you have to put names on things. And so he very casually just suggested that Berkeley, since he was a fellow librarian, he should be the person who we stick on this building. They were going to call the lecture theatre after him, which was really easier for me in the end. But they named this big, massive, ugly library, as you've all decided, after him. Quite casually, no big thought put into it. The most amount of thought that was put into it was that maybe American students would like it come to Trinity because they recognise the name. Because of course, UC Berkeley, and Berkeley had a big hand in both Yale and Harvard and their foundations as well. So what happened? We opened it out to the public early in the year in 2022. Sorry, 2023, Jesus. Yeah, so you can see that we opened it out in November and then we closed it in January, February 2023. And we got 93 submissions, 16 of them in favour of keeping the name. And the deal was, we're going to put all our evidence up online, everybody can read it. And then if you put a submission in, you have to be willing for it to be published as well. And we did that for both Inishbofin and for the denaming of the Berkeley Library. And we will do it for any other legacy issue that comes up in the next 5-10 years. And what was great about that was people had to nail their colours to their masts, and sort of say what they were going to say. And it was really interesting to read. There were really good arguments on both sides. I really thought it was an instance of Trinity finally doing what it should do, which is saying this is what we stand for. We all have to decide it together. And it also wasn't just Trinity people who could say their piece. Anybody could, which is always the battle in Trinity, to get it to realise that it belongs to everybody. So what came out of it? We did dename the library. It has now no name at all, which is a strange position to be in, and it will be renamed something next year after a lot of thought goes into that, and also a lot of public input, hopefully. Okay, so that's Trinity's Colonial Legacies, where it is up to now. I wanted to end because I'm sitting here with all of you thinking about the Docklands and how these things connect back up to where we're sitting. And I also want to think about this site. If I have time, sorry Penny, I'm just going to keep it.
You're okay.
Yeah, good. So, it's all very well to talk about Trinity. What's interesting about standing here in Unit 18 is we're on a new campus of Trinities, right? So the Trinity East is what we call it. And not many people know about the deeper history of this site in Trinity. The local community here knows all about it, of course, but Trinity people don't know much about it because we've never had teaching happen on this 5-acre site. So I just want to close off the little talk today just thinking about the importance of where we're standing, how it connects this part of Dublin back to Trinity, and then think about kind of the history that we can work with. So here we are, you know where you're sitting. This is Mackin Street. This is the site of Trinity East. I always think it's interesting because it's a relatively new part of Dublin, right? So reclaimed from various different dredging and marine operations. It was completely unpopulated, this little corner of Dublin that we're in until the mid-18th century. And I'm just going to show you a couple of maps, just again, we could have a chat about them afterwards. So it was reclaimed by this big, bulb wall sort of reclamation of land. I show these old maps, sorry now, this is nerdy stuff, right? But here you go, this is a very old 1630 map of Dublin. And what you can see to the right of the old Dublin city is that basically it's marshland around here until quite late. Here's an image from 1756, and again, still marshland. So this is Trinity College Dublin, this is the back, and we're roughly about here. And it's just kind of marshland between Ringsend and the back of Trinity. Nobody really living on it. Until this happened, the opening of the docks, which is right beside us, the Grand Canal dock, in the late 18th century. And what's interesting about this, because I know the history of this area reasonably well, having worked as the liaison officer for years. But we don't often think about the port and its relationship to colonialism and all the sugar and trade that came through it all that much. We tend to think about the work that was done by this community on the docks and in the local industries, as Brady was just mentioning a second ago. But there is actually a direct connection between these things, sugar trade and slavery and so on. And on this site, you can see at the back of this unit, there's a sugar factory in the mid-19th century, which connects to this story a little bit. So again, just to bring you back here, this is now the early 19th century, 1837. You can still see there's nothing on the site except the dispensary down the bottom. Still unoccupied, just completely empty lot in this period of time. And you can see there's a residential community just building up around it. So what we now know to be the Pier Street kind of area is just building up in relation to all the heavy industry that's coming in around the docks. You don't have the gas factory yet and so on at this point, so it's still pretty underdeveloped. But here you are, just 40 years later, and it's a totally different story. So what we have on this site here is a sugar factory. That's where that tower building comes from. And that's the first heavy industry on the site. Again, this is just for your own interest. I've always been really interested in this. What kind of sugar? They were just making Irish sugar. So this is a nationalist sugar factory, if you like. It's not importing sugar from the Caribbean at this point. It's making it from Irish crops. The sugar factory doesn't last. It is owned by the Bewley family at one point, and then the site splits into two. So here you have the gasworks, really interesting, right? So these communities are all working for these big industries as they will until the mid-20th century. You've got a big, huge distillery sending stuff back into Tullamore and back out into the world, and then you've got a big timber yard, sawmills, and that was there for most of the late 19th, early 20th century. So this is the kind of pot still whiskey. I often say if somebody wants to make revitalize a brand, if you want a small micro business like a sort of a Teeling's con job, you just resurrect this brand, and a bit like Conor McGregor, you could have your own whiskey emporium in no time. So this is what was on site. That was the whiskey that was being made. And then we have sugar works back again, and we have a timber yard which stays there. You have the dogs and cats, which people will remember, down the bottom of the site. A really important part of this site's history. It moved out to Wicklow, I think, in the end, didn't it, via a couple of different places. It was here to the 80s, is that right? Yeah. Very good. Like to check me detail. But it's most known, as we know, so people around this area know this site for two reasons. It's the old IDA, or else it's Hammond Lane. And this is the kind of stuff that was being made in Hammond Lane. If you're newer to the area, you won't know this necessarily. I'm just showing you some old ads that I found on newspapers online from the Pier Street Foundry. You see them making range cookers, but you also see them making bandstands, cattle troughs, pig troughs, anything you could make with iron was made on this site. So it's always been a place where things have been made, whether it's timber, whether it's sugar, whether it's whiskey, or whether it's ironworks. The entire sort of promenade of Bray was made by this company, and of course, famously, these lights that you see all over Dublin, right down to the present. You see them on Merrion Square, you see them down my end of the city, Mountjoy. They always have this little shamrock detail, and they always have Hammond Lane Foundry written on them. So this site produced a huge amount of stuff that's still coded into the sort of the city as we walk around it today. And here's the Hammond Lane. You see these everywhere. Anything from the 20s up until about the 1950s was usually made by Hammond Lane. And then you also have the toilet cisterns. Some of you might, if you have older houses in Pier Street, you might still have these. People use them as flower pots now, very often. So all by saying, it's worth stopping and thinking always about the deeper history of a site. And this site has colonial overtones, but not compared to the other campus at Trinity, that's for sure. But maybe that's an interesting place to just stop and take some questions. I'd be delighted to chat to you about anything that we've looked at today. Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. I've always tried to get my head around this notion that statues can be history.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I've heard this argument that the coastal ship had been pulled down because it was part of history and represented history, but I can't figure that one out. And as a professor, I know you're now going to explain this to me.
That's what I never asked me a question. I'll just talk for an hour. Don't encourage me. Yeah, statues aren't history. So statues are things that are placed on public display by whoever is in power at any one time, right? So if we put up a statue, what it means is that politicians or lawyers or somebody from usually an establishment point of view, who A, has the access to the money to raise up a permanent statue, and B, has the political clout to say, we're going to claim this little piece of public space. So statues are always about power. They project power downwards to the viewer, and even though we might walk around and say, well, sure, I wouldn't even notice half the statues that are on O'Connell Street or College Green, that's in a sense because they don't affect me, right? So I'm blind to them because I accept what they represent. They don't offend me terribly. Now, what happened when people started picking up statues and throwing them into the water was that you realized there were groups of people in society to whom that statue meant hatred of them and their identity. So if you're a young black Bristolian, and this is broad strokes now, and you're looking at a statue of Colston, who was famous for his enslavement of black people and his exploitation of them for his own profit, then you're going to feel very differently walking past that statue than some 70-year-old kind of white person who's never had to think about that very much. And that's not to say they're wrong or otherwise, but what the panic about statues has taught us is that we need to think about what we're happy to have represented in public in our time. And that was the question we had over Berkeley as well. Could we as a community stand over the continuing honouring of somebody who had enslaved other people? And most of us decided no. Same thing. Yeah, thanks for the question, great question.
Are Trinity still landowners?
Yes.
And where?
Yeah, sure. So we have a very valuable piece of land down in Dartree, which is a residential area where we have student dorms, essentially. We own a very expensive and kind of slightly useless building on College Green, which was an old bank, Foster's Place. That's a big chunk of valuable land. we've never had good use of it. It's actually so higgledy-piggledy and fallen down inside that we can't afford to do it up. Observation, we are being recorded, so I should be careful. I should be careful about what I said. And we own this 5.5 acres alongside the main city campus. Now, other than that, we don't own a lot of land around town, and we don't own basically any out in the rest of the country. The reason we don't is we were very well paid for it when the Land Acts came through between the 1880s and the 1920s. So it's not like we gave it back to the country for nothing. Trinity was handsomely paid for it, but it converted then into certain liquid assets as opposed to land ones. So yes and no, not as much as we used to. We don't own 1% of Ireland anymore, that's for sure. I say we, like I don't own it. Okay.